the second season of Let's Schmooze. I'm Doug Ebach, the original screenwriter for the movie Sweet Home Alabama. Each month I bring on guests to discuss topics related to writing for various entertainment media. Today my guests are writer-director Khalil Solins and editor Howard Hurd. They collaborated on the film Listening, currently available on Amazon Prime. Welcome, guys. So Khalil, for those who have not seen the movie, do you just want to kind of tell us what it's about, pitch the movie to us a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, hello, first of all. Nice seeing you guys. Nice seeing you, Doug. Yeah, Listening, it's a sci-fi thriller. It's kind of a tech thriller, maybe, hard sci-fi based on real science. It's sort of out there about college students who invent mind-reading technology. It's sort of like, what if telepathy was real? And a lot of stuff that we made in the movie is sort of coming true now with Elon Musk's like Neuralace and stuff like that. But yeah, it sort of explores all the implications of what a world would be like where we could read each other's thoughts in terms of, you know, personal relationships with the main character and his wife and his friends, and then getting into like government conspiracy and privacy concerns. And yeah, it gets really big by the end. But yeah.
Cool. And I've seen it and I recommend it for the people following along here that have not seen it. Can you tell us a little bit about the development of like how the project kind of came together?
Yeah, I mean, originally I wrote the script. I wrote it kind of thinking maybe I would sell it, but also keeping it, you know, low budget enough that I could produce myself if I decided to do that. And yeah, so I tried to come up with a concept that, like, you know, wasn't really CGI heavy, you know, but still had these like cool sci-fi elements. And yeah, the initial thought was just, what if someone invented telepathy? And I did a lot of research into like how that might be possible, and sort of combining some stuff that was going on with nanotechnology, and then what was going on with brain computer interfaces. And it's like, what if we combine these two fields? You know, would it be theoretically possible? And then, yeah, sort of got into, you know, developing a story around that, and, you know, having these broke Caltech students and them sort of, yeah, navigating their way through like making the invention of, you know, the century, and everyone wanting their hands on it. And yeah, I ended up, you know, got interest from like some producers around in Hollywood. Took a few meetings, but I didn't really feel like other people like got the gist of it. You know, they're kind of wanting, you know, I don't know, make it younger, sexier. I'm like, what does that mean? Oh, add more sex scenes or something. Like, I'm like, okay, that's not the movie we're making here. Whatever. You know? Like there are elements to get into that, you know, like sure. Infidelity in a marriage, and if your spouse was, you know, hearing every thought that passed through your head. But yeah, I ended up deciding to go the indie route, and yeah, we financed, produced it ourselves, put together a really good team, found, yeah, great actors, great crew. Yeah, got Howard on board to edit, and yeah, we did it real indie style, and really, yeah, for a truly indie movie, couldn't have been much happier with how it all turned out. And yeah, we had a pretty successful release, did a theatrical run, and yeah, it's actually on like re-release right now on Amazon Prime. Yeah, after having a run on Netflix, and yeah, it's on all digital mediums now. So
cool. And Howard, do you want to first of all, Howard, welcome. And do you want to talk about how you got involved, or, you know, and what your impression initially?
Partly that, and also, if this is of interest to writers, some comment quickly on what Khalil said, because by the time I did get started on the picture, Khalil had done so much thought into the screenwriting. When you mention the sexuality, and I can imagine that those that sell movies think sexuality means it's got to be a sex scene, and yet there was sexual innuendo between Ryan and Jordan, the Ryan and Jordan characters, beautifully woven throughout the dialogue as early as the first act. And that took Khalil's homework for a long time to weave it all in there, and it fits in really naturally. So that was not something that editing created. That was already in the script. As far as my getting involved, I think, Khalil had been my student a long time earlier. I perhaps it was 10 years or something earlier at Art Center. And so Khalil had called me up and asked if I wanted to talk about working on the film. And by the time Khalil had called me, he'd already shot most of the picture. The Los Angeles and the Washington, D.C. based parts of the movie, which constitutes most of it, had already been shot and even put together to some degree. I think, Khalil, you've been working on your own cut, I think. Hadn't you been? I thought you were giving it quite a bit of work.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, but it was going slow. Because, we're still, in pre-production on the Cambodia part of the shoot,
Correct.
but yeah, it had been like a couple minutes and I had like 9 minutes, or a couple months and I had 9 minutes of the film.
Right. That's right.
I was like, I can't do this.
I mean,
on my own.
Khalil, whatever else the film may also be, it's one of the most impressive, I think, independent projects I've seen in 45 years, because Khalil was somehow fighting about all these battles all at once, involving everything, including, as you say, the prep for Cambodia. And I may not remember all this perfectly well, but there were about 10 pages of script, weren't there, that were set in Cambodia, maybe even a little more, which you had elected not to shoot yet. But I thought you had 35 shooting days possibly before you did Cambodia.
It was 31 shoot days and then 5 or 6 more in Cambodia. Yeah. So
okay.
The total was 36 or 37.
Right. So when Khalil brought me, talked to me about coming onto the project, that I'm remembering now, I think I pretty much started over and just started cutting it from scratch. But we had to cut everything except for the Cambodia material, which hadn't been shot yet. So and that was I thought, a smart move on Khalil's part to decide, let's make the United States part work, but also then you had to then meanwhile prep the Cambodia material, and then you made one trip there just to scout and then another trip to shoot it, right, as I recall. So it was a lot of work to bring in the Cambodia material after we hoped we had shaken down the other scenes as well as more or less get them decent,
And so the reason I kind of wanted to have you guys on here is to talk about, screenwriters at the beginning of the process.
Right.
We kind of have this total control in the script phase, obviously thinking about production stuff. And clearly you mentioned you're thinking about something you can shoot yourself, right?
Right.
And budget concerns and all those kind of things. But I think like sometimes, particularly if you don't have maybe film school experience or something where you've done production, like the screenplay is designed for production. So, there's things that you write. Just from my own personal experience, like just a very small example of what I'm trying to talk about is, I would write things that would get cut out in post, and I would think, gee, if it got cut out in the best version of the screenplay, I would have cut that out in the screenplay, right? So I wouldn't have had to shoot it, right? If it was going to get cut out anyway. But of course, some of that's uncontrollable. You never quite know what the performance is going to be, or cutting for narrative time and so forth. But so I just kind of want to talk about that experience of how the film gets rewritten and editing, and maybe what writers can learn from that. So I guess So any comment on that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, a couple thoughts. You're talking about like actors' performances, stuff like that. We definitely went through that same process for listening. A bunch of stuff ended up on the cutting room floor, and definitely learned a lot about screenwriting going through the editing process so intimately with Howard. And some of it, like as far as actors' performances, I learned, a lot of like maybe we had a lot of dialogue didn't need to be there, especially with exposition, and like with this film in particular, it's like, okay, 2 people are reading each other's minds, and we have like a head patch here and a wire going to someone else, head patch there. And I had all this dialogue explaining the science of it. And then like once you see it on camera, you're like, okay, you just see it, you know what's going on. You don't need all that exposition, But other times I felt like, there was dialogue that was on the page that ended up not making the final film, but it was kind of necessary for the actors, I think, like that it would have been bad writing to be like, David looks into Melanie's eyes and we understand all the history between them and all the feeling, just like, you put it all, the subtext there. So you write like more dialogue and have them have an actual scene. And then the actors are able to nail it with a couple looks, and you see like all the emotion behind it. Yeah, so in some of it, yeah, that was a credit to the actors and the performances, I think. But I don't know if we would have gotten there without having some dialogue, you know, like even if it did end up on the cutting room floor.
And I do think like sometimes that expository dialogue you're talking about, when you're trying to sell a script, you know, when you're writing a script for development, sometimes that stuff has to go in there because you don't have the visual. So when, you know, a producer or a studio exec or somebody is reading it, you know, you sometimes need to over explain it. I guess like as a writer, I sometimes hope like that the director is smart enough not to shoot it, you know, that they realize it isn't really needed. I don't necessarily know that I know specifically always what those things are, but you kind of hope that, yeah, you get to the set and realize, oh yeah, we can cut this. Did the story change very much in post-production?
I mean, I think, yeah, there were a couple big changes. One of the biggest ones, the Cambodia stuff that Howard was mentioning. You know, I think I went through a process of like you, I really identify with what you're saying. As a screenwriter, you're like in total control, you know, and it's like anything you imagine and you fit it together just the exact right way. And I remember when I came to Howard at first and we were doing the initial assembly, I was like, well, like I want to see my initial vision first. Like I want to see the movie I wrote just as it is. And then we'll go in and hack everything away we don't need and make it much more efficient and everything else. And I think I was pretty detached in that process, but I kind of wanted to almost like prove the concept first, you know, be like, okay, like before we would cut a scene out of the movie, we'd be like, let's make it the best version of that scene it can possibly be. So we know for sure that it doesn't work, you know, not like we're cutting it out just because we haven't really given it a shot, you know, in the editing process. And some of that was with the Cambodia footage. Like, I think, like, I really learned a lot about the difference between kind of mystery and confusion, you know, like the Cambodia stuff throughout the film. I mean, yeah, so people understand, I guess, like the main story is, you know, these guys create something that ends up being used for like really bad purposes, and the main character escapes to the jungle in Southeast Asia somewhere, we don't know where, to like learn meditation techniques to be able to hide his thoughts, to be able to come back and help destroy the technology while his thoughts are being monitored. And so in the original script, we had these like scenes in the jungle where the main character obviously looked different, you know, had a beard now and had been through hell, you know, and I was hoping like the audience would see him and be like, okay, what's going on? Like, and they would hook them and build some mystery. But really it was like so different from the rest of the film that it just kind of confused the audience when we would do test screenings and stuff like that. You know, I realized kind of like, you know, we want mystery, but we want the audience asking the right questions, you know, and if the question is just what the hell is going on, like that's not the right question, I guess. You know, it's more like, okay, what did they do that went so wrong? Yeah, so we did assemble it the original way, where it was kind of like every 20, 30 minutes in the film, we had a scene in the jungle. And then at some point, you know, near the end of the second act, like the two timelines met up and it proceeded as normal. And we went, you know, eventually to a more traditional thing of starting at the end, starting with Cambodia, playing out the bulk of the story as normal, and then near the end of the second act going back to Cambodia and telling that story and it going chronologically. But we really had to go through that process of editing and test screenings and really seeing like, I don't know, what was coming across to the audience and to the viewer. And I kind of learned a lot about story structure, I think, through the editing process.
Was there any feedback on the script that was confusing? I mean, I don't know what kind of feedback you got. You obviously showed it to some people. Did anybody say, I don't understand the Cambodia stuff? Or
in the script, it wasn't, I didn't really get much feedback that way. I think like, in general with the script, it was kind of this cool exotic element, you know, like, maybe it was like, as far as on the page, it was maybe shorter than it was screen time, you know, when we actually shot it. But that's a good question. I don't know why it really didn't. I don't remember getting many notes about it being confusing at the script stage, but it may have just been easier to like brush past it and keep going, you know, with the bulk of the story versus like yeah, you're pausing for a minute or two and yeah, taking this segue, I guess.
You know what crosses, if I can interject a quick suggestion, I never thought of it quite this way before. When a nonverbal scene is in a script, it might be harder to assess it for anyone reading it in the good or bad sense, that they kind of just flip past it because they don't know what to say. If it's not dialogue and it isn't shot yet, maybe they can't say either way, you know, so they just couldn't tell that the Cambodia intercuts might not work. You know?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And there wasn't dialogue in the bulk of it. Yeah.
Right. Mostly not.
Do you think, so there, one thing I know that can sometimes mess up people reading a script, because you have the character's name written in the script, right?
Yeah.
Do you think there was any confusion? You mentioned you had a beard, that whether the actor was the actor or was that not a problem?
No, it wasn't that. It was just, like, I think it was just such an odd juxtaposition, that like it wasn't obvious, like this is the future, or this is the past, or an alternate reality, because in the movie does get into like mind space and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. There are kind of scenes that take place inside the brain, so to speak, so like it was more like there were all these potential possibilities for what it could be. And it wasn't necessarily like, I don't know. It wasn't all bad. I don't want to say that, but it was just like, I wanted the audience very clearly to understand, like, from the outset that this is going to get so bad, that like the world hangs in the balance. And so it built up a tension from the get-go when we have these like small scenes, at the main character's house with his wife, with his kids, suddenly like little intimate domestic scenes, like carry more weight because we know the world's gonna hang in the balance. But that's the part that what I'm saying is like the audience wasn't asking the right questions. It was more like what's going on, not like what did they do that is going to destroy the world, if that makes sense. So we made it more explicit, and just opened with it, and with a dialogue scene where it kind of explicitly, the main character says that when he goes to this monk and asks for help. So we ended up kind of reversing the order of the Cambodia stuff, actually, to get to like the meat of it, and actually open the film with that to get the audience to like understand, okay, the stakes are going to be really high at some point. And the world is going to hang in the balance, and now we can go through this kind of smaller domestic story that's going to build back up to that.
In fact, putting it positively, it's not so much that the Cambodian material was bad at all. I was loving all of it, but what was good was that the story about Jordan and Ryan and David, and also David's family story, were positively a strong pull, I thought. And maybe even, I don't know if it was more than we thought, but the point is I was loving that. I was just engrossed in that story also for the first and second acts, kind of.
Yeah, that's a good, so I don't know how much you remember the decision-making process, Howard, and you don't necessarily have to talk even just about listening, but, like it is interesting that you're kind of tasked sometimes with, in a sense, rewriting the script, but with a limited amount of material, right? So, this was not really repurposing the material, sort of just reordering the information delivery to the audience. But does that happen quite a bit where you have to kind of like construct something that wasn't even there out of material?
Actually, because, and again, it sounds like I'm just being a politician in saying that the story had fundamentally good bones before I got involved at all. But that's partly true, that it did already have good bones before I started. Maybe there's more deeper latitude in the nonverbal passages, though. Understandably, that's probably true in most movies, that where David was in training with the monk and everything, where we have all these very montagey material where Khalil had to shoot all kinds of amazing material where maybe we didn't want to know exactly how it was going to go together until we started cutting it. We did a lot of structuring then, understandably, and that would have been true with any film, that if you have long nonverbal passages, it's true. Obviously, you'd structure a lot of it in the editing. So we did that. And then also in terms of restructure, I know Khalil had to remain open-minded about taking scenes out, as he kind of touched on. There was one scene in Act 1, I think, where I believe, and Khalil, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we had David, Ryan, and probably Jordan were eating lunch, and they were like in a taco place or something. Remember that? And it was a dialogue scene.
Yeah.
But I think you felt that we just had to take it out. And that is a tricky thing about about your front story is, when do you lose sense of the magnetic pull of the story by having a little too much, either too much exposition or just something that you thought was right on the main highway, and then of the story, and then it turns out that it's not. It turns out that it's kind of a side story that you need to take out. So we did, say goodbye to some things, and it took a lot of screenings to come to that, I think.
Yeah, and I think this being my first film, like, I had what's maybe a common problem, like, you think it might be the only movie you ever work on, so you try to cram everything in there,
Yeah.
This would be a cool idea, that would be a cool idea. So I think with listening, it was less like, having to construct stuff that wasn't there, and more like, trying to really narrow it in on the A story. It's like, okay, you can have your A story and your B story, but I also had like a C and a D and an E story, that we realized really wasn't relevant by then. And another big change was the actual end of the film. Like, there was like a whole epilogue that tied to like, and as far as structure in general, like in the original script, David was kind of narrating this story to his daughter, and we see in the years later, he's in prison, and 20 years later, his daughter's grown up or whatever. And it's like what Howard's talking about, this magnetic pull of like, okay, when is the story driving forward and pulling us forward, and when is it like slowing down? And that was one of the things that, David telling the story to his daughter, even at the very end of the movie, it's like, okay, this epilogue isn't even really necessary. Mm-hmm. If that's not necessary, maybe none of the, voiceover of like David telling the story to his daughter isn't necessary throughout the whole film. And there wasn't that much voiceover, it's just a little bit there. But it was like a device that we just removed entirely. Even though that was our most expensive shoot day. It was our biggest shoot day. We shot down women's prison in LA, and it was,
God.
It was like, but then it didn't make the movie better, so you really gotta be cutthroat, and not be attached to it, and just do what's best for the film, what's best for the story.
And apropos of that, the pain of dropping one's last scene when you're a writer-director, and there's almost no way to bring it up in the editing. Gee, I think we should drop the last scene. But I'd been an assistant editor for 12 years, and I'd worked with a couple on some pretty major studio pictures that are very well known, first-time directors, but they were already highly achieved, either as actors or screenwriters. And wouldn't you know, a couple of those, the biggest pictures I ever worked on as an assistant, they dropped their last scenes. Mm-hmm. And I'd already been through it as an assistant, and I knew it could happen. And it just, you can't believe. I mean, because when you're a writer, there's a certain tone you want to end with. And the story, you've lived with the story for maybe 3 years or something with a certain ending. And suddenly somebody in the cutting room is saying, take it out. It's just really, but there is that sense sometimes. You have to listen to the magnetism in the story.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realize you'd been through it before. Yeah, I remember.
Oh my God.
Because Howard was the first one who brought it up, and he was very diplomatic every time Howard had kind of some radical ideas. Maybe what do you think about that? I remember you're always very diplomatic and bringing up these radical ideas. I was always open-minded. I was like, whatever's the story better, let's do it. And for sure, and we tested it with audiences too, informally, not like big test screenings or whatever, but we do these screenings for like 5 or 8 people. Doug, I think you came to one of those. And
so,
actually, I don't remember. You might have some. I don't remember what.
Doug had some awesome notes.
I don't remember what they were. I'm sure they were all helpful. I don't know.
No.
Yeah, and sometimes I jokingly tell my students, let's have a film festival that's the next to last cut of all your favorite films. And look at how awful they are before you take off the endings. And as I said, there's some pictures, my favorite year in Risky Business, where we changed the endings stunningly. And people will never see those endings. And it's probably just as well, kind of. Hate to say, but it is what it is.
Yeah, it isn't. I mean, I think a lot of, just film audience members and also, film fans and probably people in, screenwriters that don't go through the process because they're not directors or whatever, that, like you don't realize how different that first cut from the last cut, and like you see this like genius. It's a little bit of the myth of like the screenwriting of, well, like a true artist is going to become fully formed in the first draft. Like that never happens. It's the same thing with a cut. So, and I know like it's a thing with directors that you're aware of how hard it was to shoot something, and that can color your decision making process. Like the thing that you work so hard to get is harder to cut than the thing that was easy. So,
yeah, and I really tried to stay detached with that. But yeah, you're right that you can't just a screenplay isn't born fully formed. It is meant to be transformed into something else. And it does get rewritten when the actors are performing, and rewritten again in the editing process, and it's the way I kind of approached it was kind of, it was really making the movie was like 3.5 years of my life, maybe. And it was kind of like every day, how do I make this better? And at some point you decide, okay, well, we're moving on from just writing the screenplay into pre-production and eventually production. But the whole time I thought of it as kind of one process of like continually making the movie better, continually improving the story. And so you're continually rewriting, all the way to the very end of post-production, really.
Is there anything, Khalil, that you feel like you learned? I mean, we talked about this a little bit. Any kind of like tips for screenwriters having gone through the process? Anything that you kind of wish you knew when you were writing the script?
I don't know, like something I was kind of grateful for was like, not putting too many parameters on myself, is making a real micro budget and being like, okay, what is it that, as far as an independent film writer, director, something like I could really produce, like I could, when I was in film school, I kind of did that. I was like, I remember our first semester at Art Center was like, we had to make like 6 short films in, one term or something. So I was kind of like, okay, well, what do I have access to? And it's like, everything I shot was inside my apartment, and people do that, they try and make a micro budget movie and like, okay, let's make it all in one room or one house, or, it's horror movie all in one house, or it's all in one car, road trip movie or whatever. And yeah, that stuff's fine. But I feel like not, at the writing stage, it's kind of the most exciting stage because you can come up with any crazy, wild idea, and then the fun part is like, okay, how do we actually execute this, and like, yeah, like I remember, the scene with David, he has like an interaction with a tiger in the jungle, and I remember that was like an out of body experience, kind of like, because I remember being in my apartment in Hollywood and writing this and being like, well, there's no way, but this is fun, like, David looks at a tiger looks back, and it's like, okay, whatever. But then we found a way to make it happen, like you fly everyone to Cambodia, we found this animal sanctuary and happened to get a tiger right at the right moment, like looking right at the camera and everything else, and sort of cut it together with, so I don't know, like, I think that stuff is kind of fun, and not trying to put too many like limits on the creativity, but more like have fun while you're writing and then figure out how to do it, like, then that's the fun of production, really. So I almost feel like, I could have gone even, crazier with stuff or whatever, like, because once you get a whole team together and you're going for it, like, it's also not just you, right? None of this stuff was just me. Like when you're writing, it's all just you in a room. But, to make a movie, it takes dozens and dozens, hundreds of people, like, and you get all these people putting in their input and their blood, sweat, and tears, and you end up, creating something special. So it's fun when it's something really worthwhile and imaginative or, original.
You'd been courageous to shoot in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And it looked, when we first got the dailies, like, it's never going to work. We got tourists looking right at the camera. We're losing our light here. Remember, the coverage was hard nighttime and the wide shot was late afternoon. But I was looking at it again, and the color grading, you guys remember you color graded for 2 weeks, and it came out looking pretty good. I mean, because you reached for a really tricky scene.
Yeah, and we shot, and that's, it was like we used old tricks. We shot day for night, okay, we can't afford a ton of lights to light up, the whole memorial and the whole stairs and everything in front of it. So, we'll shoot day for night, and we'll, replace the sky in post. And but it was hard. It was, you couldn't get a permit to like keep tourists out there. We weren't a huge budget movie. And even when you are, Lincoln Memorial, like, they're a whole company. You can't, no matter how big you are, you can't go into the Lincoln Memorial and film around there. Like, so when you see it in most films, it's always CGI, and their company, that's all they do is the CGI of the Lincoln Memorial. Because even if you're a huge production, they won't give you the permit to go in there. But
right. So that was a case where you opened the picture up by thinking big, and obviously it's a little hard to tell the difference between DC and LA if you're always indoors, right? Mm-hmm. The scenes you have no sense that they went back east. So that was really awesome, that you could do that.
Howard, do you have anything that you wish screenwriters, not Khalil specifically, but just screenwriters in general knew of when they were writing their scripts, that as an editor you kind of, I don't know, messes you clean up or things that would make your life easier?
It is, I have read quite well. In fact, literally in the last week, I've looked at student scripts where I realized they could be trimming things down in the script, at the script level. And maybe just if they're willing, just in general, and this is where Khalil was already excellent at this. Khalil was always open-minded about having people look at the script and give him side reads and critiques, including after we shot as well as before he shot. But I guess being open-minded about making the cuts while it's still in the script form probably would be good, even though what Khalil says is right, that some of the dialogue does need to be there for the actors and does need to be there for as you say, for would-be producers that read your script. They'll need some of that. But I have seen scripts that could stand to be cut down in the script form also. And I guess some of this is already common knowledge, but if there's a little too much pretense of talking about dictating the editing in the script, it's probably not a good idea, because nobody knows what the cutting is going to be in the, it's ironic, isn't it? Because sometimes people say that a script is a blueprint for a film, but that might be a very bad misnomer, because in a blueprint, you really do put the walls where the blueprint says to put them. But filmmaking is not building a building, really, is it? It's much goofier than that. So you may not put the walls where the blueprint said to put them,
Well, and in that regard, I'm kind of a big believer in the process is the process, right? And that, I see it less with editing, although some, especially with montages and things where the editing is dictated, but also camera work gets dictated in scripts. And my feeling is like, how do you know the best place to put the camera? You haven't rehearsed, you haven't seen your location, and if you kind of commit yourself to this shot, particularly if you're a writer director, you commit yourself mentally to the shot, you may miss the much better shot that if you kind of went into it with an open mind and just told the story in the script.
I know it seems like it seems like a contradiction in terms that your writing shouldn't be too cinematic. That's kind of ironic. If it's just on paper, maybe it shouldn't be too cinematic. Maybe it's hard to figure that out. That's very, very tricky to figure out how to put it.
Yeah, that makes sense though. I believe that it's when someone's reading the script, you want them just engaged in the story. You want them feeling like they're watching a movie, but not because they're reading shot for shot for shot, but just, they're identifying with the characters, they're emotionally involved, they're hooked into it. The other thing, that I think I wish I understood more when I was writing and really didn't get until we got to the editing process is kind of like the concept of sequencing, and kind of like what is to be gained from, the scene that comes after the scene you're writing, like when you cut in film, that's what makes film magic, right? We have the cut, no other artistic medium has that, and it's okay, what are you cutting out, and making story efficient, but it's also like with the scene that comes after the scene you're watching right now, how does that drive the story forward or add an element you didn't think about, or like, you can end up with, the total sum being more than the parts, right? And some of that is like the what Howard was talking about with listening and the Cambodia footage, it was kind of like the main story was working so well that every time we took a detour from it, you had to like then work yourself back into the main story. And we lost a lot of power of this sequencing of having like, okay, A to B to C to D, and like it working that way. yeah, which I guess when you're writing, yeah, I hadn't, yeah, it's a difficult concept to like describe even. I don't even know the right way to describe it, you know, but when you're in there cutting, like it makes sense. But when I was writing, I certainly wasn't thinking that way. You know, I was more thinking about balancing all these different stories and giving a little bit of this and a little bit of that and the right amount of, you know, time emotionally and plot to lead the different elements or whatever, and not really thinking as much about the sequence and the drive and it making sense as far as the next like step you're going to take in the story and that being natural for the audience too.
And this is just my thing, but when I quickly looked at the picture again, what stands the test of time for me is something that Khalil probably took for granted when he was writing the script through many drafts, which is that the dialogue between David and Ryan, especially with some Jordan thrown in there, is very rapid fire. And I like their lingo, and that Khalil had to figure that out with his ear. But it's very tightly constructed, and yet it actually manages the exposition in a way that isn't very wordy and doesn't slow things down very much. Even though by the nature of the beast, if it's a sci-fi film, there's a lot of exposition intrinsic to that concept, right? Because it isn't just boy meets girl or something. It's boy meets girl with sci-fi gadgets on their heads. And so you have to explain somewhat your MacGuffin somehow. And yet I thought that the dialogue did that without feeling, you know, heavy. You know, it didn't slow anything down.
And that's a credit to the actors too, really. You know, gave them all this difficult stuff saying, yeah, they did a good job making it, you know, feel natural and and the banter and yeah, with casting, you know, we did casting of having them read together and stuff and trying different combinations of actors with each other to get the right chemistry and stuff too.
Yeah, I continue to like that a lot, just listening to their back and forth a lot. Even a second time viewer might like it a lot because of that the banter's very it's very rich, you know.
So Howard, which is easier, getting something that is really tightly scripted or getting something that is a little more loose and gives you a lot of options?
You know, the curious thing is, what I would say is for an editor to have as much time as possible might be the one big liberator, no matter what the material is to make sure the editing has enough time. Because it may be, because when you spend a long time writing a script and shooting it, you may think you know how long it'll take to edit a movie. But I worked on some pictures where even an exec producer who was actually the wife of the director was saying, when are we going to be done? And here they are, a married couple, and the director is saying, we're going to be done when we're done. And he wouldn't even tell his own wife, exec producer, oh no, we can be done by XYZ date. No, he said, no, we got to do, and it was for network and everything. And he just said, we don't know. And that sounds ironic. How can you possibly not know? If you know how long it took to write, why shouldn't you know how long it takes to edit? But you kind of don't always, you know. But as far as, how pre-thought, I mean, you can think as hard as possible with the script and still not be sure how to cut it, I guess, even, you know, and, but I guess you just have to know the characters and the writing, no matter how it'll be edited, you know, when you're writing it.
Yeah, that's, I guess, one of the advantages of indie film is you don't have a release date that you're trying to like rocket towards. I mean, I think, some of the big studio films get in trouble there where they've already announced, you know, 2 years before they even started shooting, they've announced the release date. And so you got to get it done.
But even in indie film, it's like other movies we've produced since listening, that's kind of the main bit of advice we give the filmmakers, because indie filmmakers get seduced into wanting to hit festival deadlines. Like, well, I really want to hit the Sundance deadline or Tribeca deadline or Canada, whatever it is, you know, and are rushing a rough cut. And first of all, you shouldn't be sending a rough cut. That was another thing I learned, you know, like unless your movie has Tom Cruise in it or something that festival directors know, like, are going to put butts in seats. Like, you want the movie polished and done and ready. And there's really not that much difference of waiting another 6 months and being in the next year's application cycle. But even with indie filmmakers, like we've given advice, you know, on the producing side, telling them the same thing, like, take your time with it, make it the best version of the film it can possibly be. And because you don't always have this luxury, right? Like, appreciate it when you have it.
In fact, there's a kind of a bias in the system, because if your film does poorly at Sundance, no one's going to talk about it, and no one will know how many of those there were. Whereas if your film does well at Sundance, everyone will talk about it. And that means going into it, you think your bias is thinking, well, make a big hit and we can recut it. But if you don't do well or don't even get into Sundance, it won't help that you sent it in prematurely.
Yeah, and I do think there was a period in the 90s where there were some kind of famous stories about Clerks and El Mariachi where they came in very rough, and then there was a lot of money poured into making them presentable. And but, like I think these days there's not a tolerance for that kind of like upper movie,
Yeah, and that was something we went through listening. I think because the movie was so like large in scale, sending rough cuts, I think there was some like trepidation of like, well, are they actually going to be able to finish what they've set out to achieve? And there's, even though there wasn't a lot of CGI, there were all these blank computer screens everywhere. There were tons of like, composite shots we had to do and stuff. Like, anyway, you're right on that. You got to polish it before you send it out.
Yeah, Khalil had pre-visualized so well all the computer screens that he could shoot them blank, and he knew what he wanted. And that was interesting, to cut the whole picture without any content on computer screens, and then put them all in post. I marveled at the Cambodia material. We had butterflies flying all around. Remember, they were there. I mean, anybody else that had money would have added them to make them look great, and they just happened to be there practical, right?
The advantage of a good location.
Yeah.
So, what are you guys working on now, or what's coming up next? Anything you want to talk about?
Movie my wife and I helped produce called Terrorize is coming out next week. Directed by our friend Delaney, and we're really excited about that. Howard was a bit involved in seeing some rough cuts there and giving some notes too. I've got a graphic novel I'm working on that's about halfway through. It's going to be a 12-issue run. It's about halfway completed. It's not out yet, but that's going to be called The Disease. It's a serial killer story. I'm pretty excited about. Got a really good artist named Martine Tunico who's working on that right now. And a couple other scripts I got going on too.
Cool.
That's great.
Howard, anything that you want to mention?
I have been approached by a couple people who were slowed down by the quarantine, so I'm waiting to see what that's going to mean now that we're kind of coming out of quarantine. And I guess I don't know yet. I have to contact them again and see what's going on.
Yeah, fortunately, it looks like everything is starting to finally kind of loosen up, but it was a rough year last year for sure. Stuff completed. So.
Yep.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. Very informative. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Great talking.
Thank you.
And for those watching and listening, thank you for joining us today. Be sure to check out Listening on Amazon Prime. Also, the 4th edition of the Hollywood Pitching Bible, a book I wrote with producer Ken Aguado, is now available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere else you would buy books. And finally, if you like what you heard and want to see more schmoozing about writing, please subscribe by clicking the button to the lower right. I hope you'll join us next month for more schmoozing about writing.